The day her aunt shoved her into the village dirt, every eye in the square learned how quickly a person's name could be stripped away. Imagine the scent of wet earth rising into a face already full of shame, the rasp of coarse skirts as a hand, the hand that should have protected her, pushed her down, and the terrible, precise silence that followed as neighbors turned their heads to keep from seeing what they'd helped create. Years later, that same girl would stand in front of the woman who ruined her, not as the ruined child, but as someone the village never expected to return, older, measured, and holding the truth like a mirror. What happened between those two moments is a story of power, betrayal, and a choice that will force us to ask, who is guilty when survival demands betrayal? If you want the whole unflinching story of humiliation, reckoning, and an ending no one saw coming, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss a single chapter. They pushed her down as if the earth itself could swallow the stain. Elinor tasted clay and old ale, felt the grit of the market square press into her cheek, while the church bell above the manor chimed once and then again, measuring out her disgrace. The crowd that had gathered around the steward's cart was not a mob so much as a congregation of avoidance. Faces turned, mouths pursed, fingers worrying the hems of cloaks, as if the sight of one ruined girl might tarnish them too. And there, at the heart of the silence, was Marta, her aunt's hand flat and deliberate on Elinor's shoulder, the same hand that had taught her how to braid hair and mend shirts. The hand that pushed felt heavier than it had any right to be. The accusation was small and precise, a brass token stolen from the steward's chest, the kind men threaded on cords to pay tithes with when purse was thin. The token had been found in the lintel of the bakehouse where Elinor worked, and in a winter of thin bread and thicker fear, the steward needed a culprit. He needed an example. In days like that, rumor is a currency, and the steward paid well with it. People who owed grain to the manor, people who took shelter beneath Marta's eaves, would watch and know what to do when power spoke. Elinor had been the sort to hide kindness in pockets. A crust slipped to a child, a bowl of broth left for a traveler. That kindness, in a village strung tight with hunger and obligation, could be read as recklessness or worse, complicity. She had been found near the bakehouse, sleeves flour-smeared, eyes bright with the stubbornness of youth. She had nothing to give the steward but herself. Marta's face that day was a map of choices. She was not the strumpet of gossip, nor the cruel matron some whispered her to be. She was a woman who had known too many winters, whose palms bore the patronage of the manor, and whose late husband's debts still hung like a winter cloak over her shoulders. She pushed Elinor down, and in doing so, offered the steward what he wanted, a spectacle. Later, that was how everyone told it, she would claim she had done it to spare the family worse punishment, that a public humiliation was better than a public hanging. But the way she held her chin, the way her knuckles whitened on Elinor's sleeve, suggested there were other ledgers in her head, numbers and names that accounted for more than fear. The crowd turned their faces away, but the square was not empty of witnesses. Old Thomas the cooper spat and crossed himself. The apothecary's apprentice laughed too loudly. The priest folded his hands and peered from behind the steeple. Children, who sensed truth by its suddenness, stared openly. A handful of them clutched at one another as if the day had become a new kind of lesson. Elinor's mother had died when she was small. Marta had been both aunt and guardian, sewing a life for her with thread thin as hope. That thread snapped in a single motion, and everyone watched the spool curl away. When the steward's men bound Elinor's wrists, the town constable read the charge aloud with all the ritual of law. For the taking of the Lord's token, to be tried and punished according to custom. The words were a bell that could not be unrung. Elinor's eyes searched the faces she had known since childhood, and when they met Marta's, there was a flicker, not only of betrayal, but of something far colder, calculation. Marta had a parcel of grain to sell that winter, and the steward needed buyers. Marta had creditors who preferred coin to kindness. Those things do not excuse a shove, but they explain why some hands are firmer than others when they push. As the cart for the steward's manor was prepared, a murmur passed through the crowd about the Lord's household needing servants for the winter, an oblique euphemism for anything from labor to taking in a quiet girl where she could be watched. Some said Elinor would be bound to the bakehouse at the manor, forced to knead bread under different eyes. Others whispered that the steward would place her in the retinue of a visiting captain, where a woman could be put to use and simply cease to be a nuisance. The steward smiled at the rumor as if it were a coin he could turn for interest. Elinor climbed into the cart with the same stubborn grace she had used to climb trees as a child. She kept her head high, not because shame had left her, but because she had decided to meet it. Marta lingered by the cart's side. For a moment, their hands almost touched. Elinor reached, not for clemency, but for meaning. Marta folded her fingers into the folds of her apron and would not meet her gaze. In that pause, the village held its breath, as if the air itself expected a different ending. Then the steward's scribe stepped forward with a ledger and a small brass token in his gloved hand, the proof he would pin to Elinor's jacket. He held it up for all to see, a dull disc stamped with the manor's mark. It glittered briefly in the weak sun, and then someone in the crowd, a boy who often swept Marta's doorway, cried out, pointing. He had found another object at Marta's feet as she had moved to the cart, a scrap of linen embroidered with a pattern Elinor herself had mended long ago. For an instant, the murmur became a ripple. The scrap, old and stained, fluttered into the dust. Marta's fingers closed over it with a speed that was more than reflex. Elinor looked down at the scrap in her aunt's hand. The recognition in her eyes was not of guilt, but of a question. Why would Marta carry what could convict her? Marta's jaw worked. Her face, which had been a hard coin, softened as if it might crack. The cart lurched. The steward's men prodded, and the crowd let out a single breath they had been holding. Marta turned away, hiding the scrap in her apron, and for a moment her shoulders shook, as if with laughter or with sorrow. The two are sometimes indistinguishable in a woman who has bartered her life in small, brutal payment. Elinor was driven from the square. As the cart's wheels ground over the cobbles, a young girl in the crowd, the one Elinor had once given a loaf to, ran beside it and pressed her palm against the wood. Elinor reached down, and for a heartbeat, their fingers touched. Marta watched them and then, without a sound, tucked the scrap deeper into her apron. The cart crested the hill, and the manor's gate swallowed the figure of the girl who had been pushed into the dirt. In the wake of the cart, the scrap of linen lay forgotten in the dust, until a gust of wind lifted it and sent it skittering toward Marta's feet. She did not bend to pick it up. Instead, she folded her hands, and when she did, a small folded note dropped from the seam of her cloak and slipped into the mud. A seal broken, a name written with someone else's hand, a name that, if read aloud, would turn the village's ledger of sins into something far more dangerous. The mud on Marta's sleeve dried into a map of a single, terrible afternoon. But the folded note that had slipped into the mud would not stay quiet. That night, when the manor's lamps were guttering and the steward's men were away with their ale, the scribe who kept the house ledgers took the scrap of linen and the slip of paper to a corner and eased it open by candlelight. The ink had bled where a tear had fallen years before. The hand that wrote it was not the hasty scrawl of a servant, but a careful script, the sort taught to women who had once been allowed to read. The note bore a single line and a seal broken in haste. For Elinor, if the worst comes, I will bear it for you. The name beneath was Marta's. For months after the humiliation, Marta had not spoken of that note aloud. She carried the secret like an ember, warm and painful in her palm. In the years Elinor was pressed into service, Marta's life shrank around a ledger of debts and a rhythm of small cruelties that kept the household and those who depended on it breathing. She told herself she had chosen the lesser pain. She told herself that a public shove would be easier than the slow, precise ruin the steward promised if she refused. She told herself the lie until it became a kind of law, a private statute that forbade her from naming the true price she'd paid for Elinor's silence. Elinor left the manor with hands scalded by ovens and eyes that learned quickly to read faces like other people. Read scrolls. A kind housekeeper taught her a crooked alphabet in stolen moments. A passing clerk noticed her steadiness and, in a city of strangers, offered her two things that had been denied to girls in the village: books and a name on a roster. She read histories and petitions, and the small cruelties of men who counted coin over lives began to look like an order that might be rewritten. Years of slow learning hardened into a tempered purpose. When she returned, Elinor had the look of someone who had taken the long road not for revenge, but for preparation. She came not as a shadow, but as an instrument of law, a commission pinned with a seal she had learned the worth of, given by a nobleman who had lost patience with stewards who turned their lord's lands into private tax farms. The steward who had once tossed the token like a gauntlet found himself called to answer not to the village, but to a higher authority. Elinor had the warrant. The village had the faces that still remembered mud. Marta had nothing but a pocket full of apologies she had never been allowed to say. When Elinor stood before Marta in the small parlor by the hearth, the years folded like pages between them. Marta's hair was thinner. Her face had the map of calculation and the new softness of true regret. Elinor placed the broken note between them. Marta's fingers closed over the paper, as if to stop it from saying what it had to say. She did not deny the hand. She admitted in a voice that cracked like old wood that she had chosen the spectacle to avert a worse claim on Elinor by the manor's master, a man who liked his comforts in the night and his discretion in the day. She had believed the steward's public shame would leave Elinor safe and small, rather than taken and ruined in ways that could not be scrubbed away. "You wanted me hidden," Elinor said, and her voice did not carry venom so much as the careful weight of someone measuring a balance. "You wanted me safe. You made me into something else to save what you love." The admission landed between them like a verdict. Marta bowed her head. In that quiet, you could hear the ledger beat of a life that had traded every kindness for a coin. Elinor had the power to demand punishment. The law could make Marta a parable. But law can be a blunt instrument in places where the wound is human and not legal. She thought of the children who had watched the shove and learned how quickly a community could harden its heart. She thought of the many small bargains that kept hunger at bay. She closed the note and folded it into her palm like a seed. "I could have burned your name in the records," she said. "I could have named you to the hall as an example." The room seemed to shrink around the choice. Marta's hands trembled as if the act of not being named might be the only thing that would save her life. Elinor laid the warrant down and, in a movement that surprised everyone watching, reached out and took Marta's hand. Her decision was not absolution so much as an offering, restitution over spectacle. Elinor used her authority to investigate the steward's books. She unrolled ledgers and found not a single theft, but a system of tiny extortions that bought silence with coin and fear. The steward was removed. The manor's accounts were opened. Grain was returned. Debts were forgiven for those who could prove they had been squeezed. Marta's name appeared in entries, yes, but always as a woman who had paid to protect, who had bartered away her dignity for those she loved. The villagers watched a slow rebalancing, and in the process the town learned that power can be reconfigured if someone with memory and authority chooses it. Before the day had closed, Elinor stepped into the square where she had once tasted earth. She taught a child to tie a knot, signed a promise to mend a roof, and in the corner of her cloak, the folded scrap of linen from years before waited like a relic. She handed it to Marta, who pressed it to her chest, and for the first time in a long time, Marta wept openly. Not the theater of a woman performing remorse, but the raw, astonished tears of someone who had been allowed to be small and forgiven. A small lesson remained, modest enough to sit on a threshold, that cruelty is often a choice made out of fear. Not only malice, that power without memory doubles its harm, and that sometimes justice does not require a pyre, but a ledger set straight. If you carry one thing from this story, let it be that names matter. How we name wrongdoing shapes what we allow to grow. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for other tales of truth and consequence. We dig into the past to pull its corners open, and your subscription helps these stories find a voice.